Here is Daryl, an African-American man, staying present, staying patient, staying respectful, even when someone is, potentially spewing kind of hate speech in his face. He literally has a closet in his house full of KKK robes that people who used to be part of the Klan have given him when they left as a result of these unlikely friendships.
Hey everyone, it's Disagreeing Well, the podcast about polarization, why it matters, what drives it, and what we should be doing about it. I'm your host, John Malloy, and this week we're focusing on efforts in the United Kingdom to fight division and bring people together. Our guest is Alex Evans, founder and executive director of the organization Larger Us. Now, as a former politician and political advisor myself, what I found particularly interesting about Alex is that he came to this role having spent much of his career inside politics and global campaigning, working in the UK government, the UN, and leading major campaigns. In other words, Alex didn't simply observe polarization from a distance. He saw the forces that are shaping it from the inside and stopped to ask what it's doing to our society and to himself. That questioning led him to write The Myth Gap, a book about why facts alone don't often persuade people and the power of stories to bring about change and counter our tendency to divide the world into us and them. All of these experiences led him to launch Larger Us, an organization focused on using psychology to bridge divides. Now, we're going to spend this conversation asking Alex about his journey, what he's learned about polarization, and what it might actually take to move from an us and them world towards a larger us. Alex, welcome to Disagreeing Well.
Thanks, John. Great to be with you.
Now, let's start with your story. And I was fascinated by it. Obviously, we come at this from slightly different angles, but we both have this political background. So tell me about the work that you did and sort of some of the lessons you learned about the issue of polarization.
Well, I early on in my career, I was a special advisor, which is like a special assistant in Canada, to two Labour cabinet ministers back when Tony Blair was the prime minister in the 2000s. Both of them were secretaries of state for international development. This was back when the UK had a whole separate department for international development that was not at that point part of the Foreign Office. Did that for about 3 years. From there, I went to working at New York University's Center on International Cooperation, which is a think tank in NYU that mainly works on UN and multilateral issues. I did a couple of secondments to the UN Secretary General's office from there. But I think the thing that really set the scene for me starting to get into the psychology of polarization and to begin to think about it in a different way was actually when I was doing a job as the writer for one of these high-level panels that the United Nations loves to do. You know, this sort of thing, John. And this one was a high-level panel on global sustainability. I had such high hopes for this. I thought it would get a group of policymakers together and they'd have space to ask big questions and come up with big answers. And it was very humbling for me to see how little ambition there was in the room. There was really no appetite to get into big issues at all. On the contrary, all of these political leaders just wanted to avoid anything that might force them to make additional policy commitments. And that really set me wondering about what it is that opens up or conversely closes down the political space for really transformational change. And that was when I started to think about the whole thing of the shared stories that we use to make sense of the world and where we might be trying to get to and how to get there. And beneath it all, who we are as societies. And those were some of the themes that led me to write The Myth Gap, which came out in 2017.
But let me just push back. You were in these roles, you're advising politicians, you're helping to write important documents. I mean, at the end of the day, there would be a lot of people that would say you were on the side of justice, you were on the side of virtue, you were preventing the other side. I guess in different contexts, the other side would take different forms. You were preventing them from getting into power and doing damage. Why not embrace that? Why not become a sort of justice warrior and push hard and defeat the enemy?
Oh, well, it's an interesting one. I mean, I guess my first pushback on that would be that I felt there was a lot less power in these rooms than I had thought there would be before I started working in them. I mean, my theory of change, if you like, was that if you did high quality research and got it in front of policymakers, they would be both motivated and in a position to actually do something about it. And that was what I discovered was much less the case than I had supposed. But to the other part of your point about whether, we in inverted commas are the good guys and they, whoever they may be, are the bad guys. And so progress is all about us defeating them. I must admit, even during my time in the British government, where I actually spent time as part of Labour's general election war room team in 2005, I never really saw politics in those us and them terms. I mean, on the contrary, on the issue that I worked on, international development, there was at that time a really strong bipartisan consensus between Labour and the Conservatives in favor of spending more on aid and trying to work towards more just trade policies and so forth. A little bit like a decade later, there was a very strong bipartisan consensus around climate change and the need to reduce emissions faster and more ambitiously. Sadly, both of those consensuses have since fractured. But it seemed to me then, and it seems to me now, that those sorts of consensus across the political spectrum on the really big global risk issues of our times that are, of course, really shaping the kind of future that we're all going to be inhabiting, you need that consensus. And the thing I think that captures this best for me is there's a writer I really like called George Marshall. He's a great expert on the psychology of how people think about climate change. And he has this observation that climate change is such an enormous issue that touches on just about every aspect of life you can think of, that it's way too big to be solved with anything less, as he puts it, than a near total commitment across society. We're just not going to achieve a breakthrough outcome by the kind of 10 or 20% of people who are so-called progressive activists kind of defeating everybody else. You must have a far broader consensus on these enormously complex issues that are going to take decades to figure out.
And yet, particularly when you were working on the political side, so much of campaigning, I mean, you spoke about some issues where there was a bit of a public consensus, but so much of campaigning is about dividing people. Did you start to notice that? Did you start to be troubled by it? I mean, how did you deal with that part of politics?
I mean, certainly, I used to have lively debates when I worked in government with people who worked for the Labour Party, who tended to be much more tribal in their outlook and very much like we, Labour, are the good guys and they, the Conservatives, are the enemy. I realized at that point, I think we have different ways of seeing the world. And I figured like maybe my perspective was more the perspective of the policy wonk. And theirs was the perspective more of the kind of political campaigner who does see the world more in them and us terms. But I think you're absolutely right in the kind of the underpinning of your question that there is a conventional wisdom in campaigns that a divisive campaign that has a really clear enemy, ideally a kind of villain who you can blame everything on, that is often supposed to be a more resonant campaign. I mean, I've heard seasoned campaigners at organizations like Oxfam say, never embark on a campaign without a good baddie. For a long time, when I was starting to get into more campaigning type work, a decade after I was in government, I often thought that was true. But then, of course, we had the experience of Brexit in the UK, which was less like a normal political disagreement and more like a kind of septic wound in our politics. And that led me to really question that conventional wisdom. And, you start to think that maybe this is eroding the foundations of a healthy democracy.
And yet it spills over. I mean, you mentioned the issues around climate change. I mean, there are certainly voices on, I don't know, maybe it's unfair to say both sides, but different perspectives of it, who want to make progress by labeling the other side. Here in Canada, we have climate activists who vilify oil companies, oil company executives. They obviously don't care about the planet. They don't care about the environment. Isn't it awful? We need to defeat them, that sort of thing. But your point, building on the work that you mentioned, is that we're not going to make progress if we use this sort of enemy approach.
I mean, I think there's always a really interesting question at play here about who or what we are making the enemy. I mean, you might think, for example, that there's no problem with making. I mean, I'm a sort of liberal on the political spectrum, so obviously I look at what Donald Trump is doing in America, and I'm horrified by most of it. And so I might think, well, clearly I don't want to fall into the trap that Hillary Clinton famously made in 2016 when she described Donald Trump's supporters as a basket of deplorables, because of course what that did is fire them up. It really energized them. I mean, there's lots of evidence to show that feeling like you're on the receiving end of contempt is like about the most energizing thing that can happen in politics. I remember the Arab Spring and how there was lots of evidence to show that one of the motivating factors in causing people to rise up was a feeling that they were just held in contempt by their ruling classes. So contempt never leads anywhere good. But you could say, okay, well, I'm not going to fall into the Hillary Clinton trap and call people's supporters deplorables, but it's still fine to kind of make Donald Trump the enemy. But I think the problem with that is that often the people who do support him will still feel like they are being made the enemy, like liberals despise people like us. And then you end straight back in the kind of mutual radicalization dynamic that we've seen so much of in politics over the last 10 years. So where I've ended up is thinking that actually it's very rarely, if ever, a good idea to sort of make an enemy out of people, but that it's fine to make an enemy out of systems that kind of muck things up for all of us. And I think that in some ways, this is said to have been the transition that Nelson Mandela went through when he was in prison on Robben Island, that he went in thinking that white people were the enemy, and he came out thinking that the system of apartheid was really the enemy, and that was a really important perspective shift. And I think there's a lot to learn from that.
And what's fascinating about our discussion thus far is it's been about perceptions and the way issues are presented, and yet you began with your initial thoughts that all you had to do was get that list of killer facts and present it to people. And I've often recall conversations about polarization where people say, well, it's the other side doesn't understand. If only the other side could be presented with the facts, they would see the error of their ways and come to our virtuous side. So you've obviously gone through quite a transformation, thinking about the role that facts play. That's sort of the nice segue into the book, whose subtitle is what happens when evidence and arguments aren't enough. So tell us about that sort of evolution in your thinking about the killer facts. Why would anyone dispute? Why would anyone question? And that leads into the book.
Well, in some ways, I think because I worked on climate change in particular in the back end of the 2000s, I saw political polarization up close before lots of people working on other issues saw it, because I think in some ways climate was one of the first issues to get really polarized, at least in the US. I remember, as you will, the 2008 presidential election between Barack Obama and John McCain. And I mean, it seems incredible in retrospect, but here was an election between a Democrat and a Republican who agreed with each other that climate change was caused by humans, that it was urgent to do something about it, and that meant reducing harmful emissions from burning fossil fuels. You had a genuine bipartisan consensus. And I remember that American climate campaigners at that point basically thought that, getting climate legislation through on the Hill was very straightforward. They had this legislation, it had already passed the House. They just needed to get it through the Senate, and then everything would be nicely set up for the big Copenhagen climate summit that was due to take place in 2009. And what none of those people, and I knew so many of them and worked with many of them, what none of us had seen coming was, of course, the Tea Party movement in America, which spent that summer in 2008 organizing town halls in places all over the United States, besieging legislators and showing up on talk radio and so forth, and very effectively polarizing the issue of climate change. And then people in favor of climate legislation just didn't know what hit them. And there was a seminal analysis that they commissioned after prospects for climate legislation in the US had fallen apart, from Theda Skocpol, a sort of great professor of political science at Harvard. And basically, her analysis to them was, you guys tried to fight this debate with facts and data and evidence. And the Tea Party fought it on the basis of a really resonant story. And guess what? A story beats a pie chart. And this was a really, really hard won lesson. But I think that the hopeful part of it is that the climate movement learned that lesson quite quickly and rapidly started reframing climate as a story. And of course, one of the great examples of that was the papal encyclical Laudato Si that followed a few years later, which was not full of kind of data and pie charts. Instead, it was a very morally grounded story about our responsibilities to future generations. And I think that was part of what meant that the Paris Climate Summit in 2015 succeeded where the Copenhagen Summit in 2009 had failed.
And then came your book, The Myth Gap. So tell us about the myth gap. What's a myth and why do we have a gap in it?
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, I got really interested in the shared stories that we use to make sense of the world. And in particular, the really kind of deep shared stories, some of which, of course, are religious in nature, but they don't have to be. I mean, they can be about heroes and villains and quests and what have you. But these stories really resonate for us as humans at a deep level. I always enjoy the Jonathan Haidt quote that the human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. However much we like to think we're these kind of rational beings that evaluate evidence and so forth. I mean, actually, we're motivated by stories. And the thing that fascinates me is that, of course, religious affiliation is declining really quickly. And more broadly, in our kind of very modern, rational, left brain times, we kind of have concluded that we don't really need myths anymore. And if you look in your thesaurus and look up the word myth, that's where you find it in the same entry as words like bunk or fabrication. And why, when we talk about the idea of an urban myth, it just means something that's wrong. And I think that myths are different from that. They're not true in the way that, like, chemistry or math are true. They're true in the way that Shakespeare or great poetry are true. They tell us something profound about the human condition and what's important and what we should be aspiring to. And I think that when we think we can do away with myth, we're in all sorts of danger. I mean, this is something that the great psychotherapist Carl Jung understood decades and decades ago, where he's got this great quote where he says, the man who thinks he can live without myth is like one uprooted, having no link with the past or with the ancestral life within him. And I think that's really true, because the thing is that nature abhors a vacuum. If we get rid of the old myths, new stories are going to fill that gap, that myth gap referred to in the title. And in the book, I argue that, for example, the myth that the marketing industry offers us, which is that you are what you buy, which has had tremendous power in the modern world. But another set of myths, or anti-myths, as I call them in the book, these sort of stories that don't really help us in any way, are the stories that populists offer, which are stories about a them and us, how we're threatened by some shadowy other and we need to build bigger walls to keep them out. And these are myths that are not actually helping us at the beginning of the 21st century, faced with the kind of, enormous global risk issues that we're up against.
And I mean, in the book, you talk about the myth that we're running out of food, we're running out of resources. The world, I mean, this is a fact, the world is growing quite quickly in terms of population, but that's a huge threat. This sort of builds into it. It perhaps isn't spoken, but we need to batten down the hatches, build walls around our borders, and make sure that we survive. And you point out that, as you said earlier, it's not a helpful myth, but it's also not necessarily based in fact.
And yet, the interesting thing about all these kinds of collective stories is that they do have very, very serious power to become self-fulfilling prophecies. I mean, the example that I always reach for to illustrate this is what happens when you have a run on a bank. It begins as a story circulating that there isn't enough money to cover everybody's deposits. But the thing is that then, as people start to believe the story, they then begin to act accordingly, in this case by forming a queue outside the bank. And suddenly, what was just a kind of rumor or some gossip or a story circulating becomes very hard edged reality. And you've got central banks staging emergency interventions to prop up this failing retail bank, etc. And of course, we saw this kind of thing happen in 2008. We had a bank here in the UK called Northern Rock, and it did fail because of exactly this sort of thing. And to your example there about stories of resource scarcity in a world of kind of climate breakdown and water shortages and ever increasing demand for land and so forth, this also can have really powerful real world consequences when enough people believe the story, because that story of resource scarcity, it's every country for itself in a world of kind of growing shortages, led to a situation both in 2008 and then again in 2011, where it was believed that there wasn't enough food to go around globally. and major food exporters started to impose food export restrictions. And you can imagine the carnage that this unleashed on international trade markets, where food importers were suddenly frantically buying up what they could still access on international markets. And it took a sort of challenging situation and made it so much worse. And it was the same kind of panic story becoming panic reality that you see in a run on a bank. And I remember talking at the time to a guy who worked in the UN Secretary General's office. And I remember having a conversation with him, and he was shaken because he'd just come off a call where the UN Secretary General had been on the phone to a head of government, literally begging this head of government not to impose food export restrictions. I mean, that's how much, the rubber hits the road with this kind of thing. And right now, of course, we're at risk of seeing something similar because of the impact of Trump's war in Iran and what that's doing to kind of security of supply of things like natural gas and fertilizer. But that's a whole other story.
And of course, I assume that Brexit was all about myths, the good myths and the anti myths. You were quite involved in the campaign. I don't want to bring back painful memories for you, but how did you see these myths at work? How did you see I guess the myth and the anti myth, or whichever way you want to categorize it?
I mean, I think what was really interesting with Brexit, a bit like with Trump's election in 2016, was that you had two sides who both felt at a really deep level that their whole way of life was at stake. I mean, all the people that voted leave in Brexit, I think, felt passionately that they were trying to defend British sovereignty from a kind of unaccountable, encroaching bureaucracy, and that, in the phrase that was used at the time, this would usher us into the broad sunlit uplands of a brighter future. Meanwhile, Remain voters like me felt that this was an awful existential threat that was kind of, being fanned by this nostalgic vision of an imperial past that Britain used to have, and that, it'd be an absolute catastrophe to be stepping away from these kind of interdependent international relationships in the kind of context that we're in these days. And so, you had a lot of threat perception on both sides. And that's a very, very powerful story, that the idea that your way of life is at stake. And I think that undoubtedly contributed towards the polarization and the toxicity that we saw. And of course, this was around the time that the whole debate about so-called post-truth politics started off, when, people were really realizing that stories are the most important thing in these political issues. But it was also, Brexit was one of the things that really prompted me to reconsider some of these conventional wisdoms in campaigning that we talked about earlier, because, I was part of a campaign that was trying to secure a second referendum on the shape of any eventual deal, the terms of the UK's departure from the EU. And I became really uncomfortable by how some of the organizations we were in coalition with, also on the Remain side, were, just as we were talking about a minute ago, really showing contempt towards Leave voters. I just thought, this isn't going to lead anywhere good. And is it actually true that to be an effective change maker, you have to be a divisive voice? Is it not possible to bring about hopeful change by bringing people together and bridging divides instead of amplifying those divides? So that was really the kind of question that experience left me with.
Part of the answer, obviously, is yes, because you've devoted the last number of years to looking at it. But how did you reach that conclusion that there is a better way? I mean, I left the book, The Myth Gap, hanging there for a second. I mean, what was the conclusion, for those who haven't read it, of where we should go? And then how did that lead into where you are today with Larger Us?
Well, where the myth gap really ended up was the idea. I mean, in some ways, it was an argument to change makers that they needed to think of themselves much more as storytellers. So, whether you are running national or even international campaigns, or whether you're a community organizer or a local faith leader, I mean, there's all kinds of different change makers, obviously, but that we need to pay much more attention to stories, that we've spent too much time leading just with facts and evidence. I mean, this is what climate campaigners used to do. We used to think, oh, well, we've got the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and, their report is as thick as a phone directory. It's absolutely full of facts. Clearly, the science is on our side. And once everybody understands that, it's going to be case closed. And as we've talked about, that wasn't the case at all. It turns out the more resonant story was the thing that determined that issue. So really the myth gap is a plea to change makers of all sizes to say, think about the story that you're using. And in particular, let's all think about the deep shared stories that we need for this moment that's full of these growing global risks. So I kind of finished that book by saying that the sorts of myths that we need right now will help us to do three things. First, to help us think of a longer now. So, where now is measured not just in seconds or the lifetime of a single political administration, but we're thinking instead over generations long time spans. Secondly, that we should have stories that help us to see ourselves as a larger us rather than a them and us. I hadn't come across this idea when I wrote The Myth Gap, but I love that idea of Albert Einstein's that life is all about expanding our circles of compassion beyond just our immediate friends and family, beyond quotes, people like me, but to people who may see the world very differently, or people who may live on the other side of the world who we've never met, or future generations or other species, that actually increasingly identifying with and acting as that much larger us is really important right now. And then finally, I think we need myths that help us to imagine a different idea of the good life. I mean, these days, to the extent that we try and measure that, we usually do it with GDP growth. And so the suggestion in the myth gap was, what if we tried to measure our growth in our maturity as a species rather than growth in how much stuff we consume? That would seem to be a better metric, and that would need a different story to underpin it. So that's where the myth gap ended up. And certainly, that set of ideas has underpinned some of the work I've done since.
That didn't lead you directly. I mean, you wrote the book, you were still involved in campaigning, but it eventually led you to the Collective Psychology Project, which is the sort of the first iteration of Larger Us. So tell us about that initial step and some of the first work that you did.
So really early on, I mean, as we talked about, like the experience of working on Brexit made me really fascinated in polarization and whether you could be an effective change maker by bridging divides. But then the next thing was that I got really interested in the psychology of polarization and what to do about it. And there were really two things that planted the seeds of that. One was that when I was working as a campaigner, Cambridge Analytica burst onto the scene. You remember that, their whole prospectus was that they claimed to be able to mash up social media micro-targeting with psychological profiling, with, they claimed, the effect that this would in effect sort of weaponize our own anxieties against us, and that they use this psychological insight to amplify division and thereby influence the outcome of an election. Now, I think in retrospect, lots of analysts think that maybe they oversold those capabilities. But at the time, I was so fascinated and I thought, wow, this is a really big deal. I wonder what it would take to inoculate myself or my community or a whole society against this deliberate mass trolling. So that was one thing that made me think about psychology and polarization. The other one was that I then ended up taking a sabbatical after this campaigning job working on Brexit. Um, and we ended up living in Jerusalem for 6 months for my wife's work. And this was in 2018. I hadn't been to that part of the world since about 2005. And the polarization was so much worse between Israelis and Palestinians. Even in 2005, which was during the Second Intifada, most Israelis and Palestinians knew people on the other side of the divide, which helped to kind of, to some extent, limit the potential for dehumanization. But by 2018, that was no longer the case. The separation wall had been there for longer than a decade. So people didn't know people on the other side. So it was very depressing time to be living there. But while I was there, I met an extraordinary woman called Gina Ross. Gina is a trauma psychologist. She's Israeli American, but had grown up in Syria. So she had this very deep cultural fluency in both sides' perspectives on the conflict. And her insight that she said to me was that if you really want to understand this conflict, you've got to understand the mental health context, because everybody here has some degree of continuous traumatic stress. And that shows up not just in individual psychological factors, things like anxiety, hypervigilance, irritability, but it also provides the perfect petri dish, if you like, for othering to flourish. Othering, this phenomenon where you perceive some external group as inherently inferior and or threatening, which of course is exactly what we see flourishing right now. And I thought this is absolutely fascinating. It was really the first time I thought about the theme we touched on of threat perception and what happens when that really gets out of control in politics. And I just thought this is relevant far beyond Israel and Palestine. This is relevant to Brexit. This is relevant to the rise of the far right in Europe, certainly to Trump in the US. And I became absolutely obsessed at that point with the psychology of political polarization.
So, Alex, that led you to the Collective Psychology Project. And what was that? I know it's a forerunner to Larger Us, but what did you do through this project?
Well, the Collective Psychology Project was really like a year and a half research study. I was very interested to really put ideas and people from my old world of politics and campaigning in conversation, if you like, with ideas and people from this new world to me of psychology, and see where the overlaps were between these disciplines. And the result was a report called Building a Larger Us, which I think came out in the spring of 2019. And that was the sort of first attempt I had made to start coming up with a framework for thinking about some of the ways in which, if you like, our states of mind and the state of the world shape and influence each other. And some of the ideas that report got into were things like fight, flight, freeze, how we respond to perceived threats, and how that can then, change how we show up politically as citizens. It had lots to say about the idea of in group bias, the idea that whenever we're part of a group, whenever we perceive ourselves to be part of a group, we automatically perceive other members of that group more favorably and tend to give them preferential treatment. That's often fine in many areas of life, but it's usually problematic when it shows up in politics, because that's obviously the wellspring of all sorts of prejudice and intergroup conflict and nativist nationalism and so on. So the report had lots to say about that. And then the third idea it really talked about was that it's really important that we feel a sense of agency in our lives, that we actually have some power in shaping our futures, because when we feel powerless, that is absolutely a sort of emotional register that populists excel at exploiting. But I think really the core idea in that report was that if you look overall at the ways in which our states of mind and state of the world affect each other, it can set the scene either for a vicious circle, which was called a breakdown loop in the report, or a virtuous spiral, which is a breakthrough loop. So if you imagine what a breakdown loop looks like, it would be something like, you feel like you can see real world crises out there in the world, very much like the poly crisis that we're living through at the moment. And then that affects how we feel inside in our states of mind. We may feel anxious, we may feel depressed, we may feel threatened. And that then shapes how we show up as citizens. We're more likely to show up in ways that are kind of divisive or prejudiced, etc. We're fragmenting rather than coming together. And that, of course, only makes it harder to solve the big issues that we're up against in the state of the world. And then the state of the world gets worse, our states of mind get worse, and so on and so on. So, really, the question at the heart of that report was, how do we reverse the polarity of this cycle so that, to put it the other way around, we start to feel like things are getting better in the state of the world? That makes us begin to feel more open, more confident, more hopeful. And then we show up in a completely different way, in a much more pro social way as citizens, which actually increases our collective bandwidth for solving shared problems. And that's when you begin to see a breakthrough loop. And obviously, what we see a lot of at the moment in our politics is breakdown loops. But I remain hopeful that it's possible to tip those into the opposite state, where we're instead in the virtuous spiral mode of starting to see breakthroughs.
I have to pick up on this because I'm sure a lot of people, and you reference it, but a lot of people hearing what you've just said would say, good grief, between, the roughly 5 or 6 years since that report came out, it seems that the world has descended into more chaos. Do you feel discouraged by what's happening, or do you think this virtuous circle is still possible?
Well, certainly it does feel like things have got more challenging in the last few years. And obviously, when you look at things like, the current war in Iran or the rate of climate change impacts kicking in, there is lots to be deeply, deeply concerned about. But I think there's also something interesting here about sometimes we just assume the worst in our situation. And that can kind of take us into a breakdown loop on its own. And the reason I mention that is I saw a really interesting Substack piece just earlier today by the American writer Micah Sifry, who's one of the most thoughtful voices I know about campaigning in the United States. And the argument he was making was that when you look at pro democracy activists right now, there's a lot of doomerism around. And I think, we've both heard this, right? You hear people talking about the erosion of civic space, how democratic norms are under threat, how the far right is on the march, and so on. And that can take us into a bit of a defensive crouch just in itself. And the argument he was making in this Substack piece was that that is all true, but it is also true that there's been tremendous innovation and progress in grassroots organizing to protect democracy since 2016. And it's really important that we focus on that too, because that will then cause us to feel encouraged and nudge us towards a breakthrough loop. So I'm not saying that it's all a question of, do we take a glass half full or a glass half empty approach? Of course, there are objective facts out there in the world. But I think it is important that we stay hopeful, that we stay aware of the areas where we really are making progress. And I think there's a good number of them.
And this sense of optimism and the findings of the report that led to the formal creation of Larger Us. So, can you tell us a bit about that evolution, what the goals were, how the organization has evolved, and what does the organization do?
So I think it's really, I mean, the evolution from Collective Psychology Project to Larger Us was really about getting applied. As I mentioned, the Collective Psychology Project was really just a research inquiry. It was almost a little bit theoretical, if you like. With Larger Us, we still do research. But what we do a lot more of that was not part of the work at the Collective Psychology Project is we run trainings, particularly aimed at change makers. That's everybody from kind of national or even international campaign strategists through to grassroots organizers, all geared towards supporting people to become a different kind of change maker, the kind of change maker that excels at bridging divides rather than deepening them, at bringing people together rather than causing them to fragment from each other and so on. All still with that very psychologically informed approach, but aimed at driving real world results. And in practice, I mean, it's worth saying that Larger Us remains a really, really small organization. There's two of us who are actually on staff, and then another half dozen or so who work as associates. And the way we think of our work is really as being a learning lab. So we've deliberately stayed small. We have no ambition to become, a 20 or a 50 person organization, or to kind of grow and grow the programs that we run. Instead, what we like to do is come up with ideas, design trainings or other things that then test those ideas in the real world, and then be completely transparent about what we've learned from that, with the organizations, the partners, and the sectors that we work with. So just to give you one example, a program that we're running at the moment, that we're very fond of, is called Let's Talk Climate. This grew out of this fascinating finding in the UK, but it applies in many other countries too, that people don't actually talk about climate change that much. In fact, I think in the UK, it's, I can't remember the exact number, but it's well over half of us who rarely or never talk about climate change. When we first encountered this fact, we thought, this is so weird. Climate change is clearly this enormously important issue. How can it be that we're not talking about it? And then we thought about it some more and we thought, oh, actually, this makes total sense, because we know how this feels from our own lives, that you're in a social situation, maybe you're hanging out with colleagues or you're at the pub or something, and you're a little reluctant to raise climate change because you worry that you'll come across as a real downer, or that people will think you're being preachy, or they'll think you're being hypocritical because you don't live an environmentally perfect life. And, the upshot of that is that we're reluctant to have these conversations, but that matters because what we talk about is what is politically salient. It's what political parties and policymakers are paying attention to. So, what we designed was a training that we run with all sorts of different partner organizations that seeks to give people the confidence, the motivation, and above all, the skills to have positive conversations about climate change across political divides. And we've now run this with more than 1,000 people, with something like 20 different partner organizations. We've learned such a lot. And now we're trying to sort of create ripple effects by working with campaigning organizations to help them integrate the learning from that into how they run their own campaigns. So that's just one example of the kind of work that we do.
And I'm fascinated by this work because this is a question that comes to mind. How do you deal with bridge building when the bridge is being built to another side which disagrees with you, which you may objectively think are a dangerous group of people? You know, people that are saying climate change is not a big issue, to use your example, or in other cases where you see them posing a danger, and yet you're being asked to build a bridge. Does that mean compromise? Does that mean giving up on your principles? I guess I'm just wondering, how do you deal with the need, I guess the political need to almost convert the other side, to get them on side, versus bridge building and understanding when you may think they're actually dangerous?
Right, right. Great questions. There's lots in there. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that our whole approach, whether it's on Let's Talk Climate or many of the other programs we run, is very interested in the idea of so-called curious conversations as a way of bridging divides. And the first most important precept of any curious conversation is listen first. One of the points we gently make in our Let's Talk Climate training is that so-called progressive activists, the sort of people who, are most fired up about climate change, that maybe go on protest marches or are very politically engaged, very active on social media. Oftentimes, if you're a progressive activist, and I am one myself, we're often very good at talking to ourselves. Social media obviously sorts us into groups of the like-minded. Many forms of activism, I think, can sometimes fall into the trap of sort of playing to the grandstand, preaching to the choir, preaching to the people who already agree with us. And our starting point is, we're not going to win on an issue like climate change with the 13-14% of the population who are progressive activists. We've got to do a better job of engaging, first of all, the kind of so-called, some people call them persuadables, I call them engageables, but the people in the political middle. So if you look in the UK at polling data, you've got a group of people who are really fired up on climate change. You've got a group of people who are very skeptical of climate change. And then you've got a lot of people in the middle of the political spectrum. In an opinion poll, they will show up as minding about climate change, thinking it's caused by humans, that we need to do something about it. But it's not necessarily top of mind for them. It's not necessarily their highest priority. If it starts trading off against other issues or involving cost or inconvenience, it may start slipping down the rankings. So those are the first people that we need to be reaching, which is something that activists and campaigners are not always as good at as they could be. And so our argument in the training is the way to engage those people is to listen to them. We're really keen on the quote from the American writer Amanda Ripley, who says that people need to feel heard before they will listen. And many, many people have not had the experience of feeling heard on climate change or on lots and lots of other issues. Again, it's one of the things that gives populists their entree, this sense of like, people don't listen to us, and I'm, furious and angry and frustrated. So we encourage people who do our trainings to do the work of listening. And then once you've done that and started to establish some sort of, emotional bandwidth, some kind of shared interests, or, the fact that we all care about this community that we live in, or whatever it may be, at that point, it's possible to start sharing some of what we feel about the issue. But that's really different from starting the conversation in megaphone mode. And it's also different from feeling the pressure that you have to, single-handedly bring about some Damascene conversion, so that someone who enters the conversation, a little bit ambivalent about climate change, is going to exit the conversation like a fully fledged climate activist ready to glue themselves to the road. We encourage people who do the training to treat every conversation as a little experiment, a little voyage of discovery, to explore what the other person thinks, some of what you think, and just, find out about each other. To the other part of your question about engaging the most skeptical people, I mean, I think that curious conversations can work for that as well. One of the most inspiring people I know of in this field is Daryl Davis, who's an extraordinary African American blues musician who, in his spare time, has befriended and helped to leave like more than 150 white supremacists. He befriends people who are part of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. And through becoming friends with them, gives them space to change their minds, to see the inconsistencies in their views. He would always be adamant that he is not changing their minds, and that that's a really important point, that they're changing their own minds. But it really works. What I would say about that is that's the most demanding end of the curious conversations spectrum. Clearly there's very real emotional labor involved in that. I mean, here is Daryl, an African American man, staying present, staying patient, staying respectful, even when someone is, potentially spewing kind of hate speech in his face. I, as a kind of white person, would never, dream of telling a person of color that they ought to do this work, because there is enormous emotional labor involved. But when people like Daryl do feel called to doing that work, it can be utterly transformative. And he literally has a closet in his house full of KKK robes that people who used to be part of the Klan have given him when they left as a result of these unlikely friendships. So even in those kind of extreme conditions, curious conversations can work.
And what about sort of halfway in between? So, not the extreme, if we stick with climate change deniers, the ones who are to silence the left or progressives, but people who just think it's overblown, it's exaggerated, the evidence is, well, whatever. I mean, let's get on with it. We've got an economy to run. How do you engage with those individuals? It's not as demanding as what you outlined, but it's a bit more challenging. And there is this question of, to what point are you trying to convert them, and where does listening fit in?
Well, another person whose work we really admire on all of this is Catherine Hayhoe, who is an American climate scientist. She's actually one of the lead authors on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but she also literally kind of wrote the book on climate conversations. She's very inspirational on this. But she always observes that the key to a successful climate conversation is to talk about what the person you're talking to loves and cares about. I mean, that could be the town that you both live in. It could be their grandchildren. It could be some sport or pastime that they're really passionate about. I mean, in a way, the point with climate change, since we're talking about that issue, is that it touches on every aspect of our lives, right? I mean, it touches on the work we do, how we get to work, the food we eat, our homes and how we heat them. I mean, like, everything you can imagine. And as the impacts get more intense, those are also touching on more and more areas of life. So, if you care for elderly relatives, they are at risk from heat waves that climate change is driving. Or if you're really passionate about playing football, that is increasingly going to be affected by extreme weather events like flooding. I mean, there's so many different entry points to a conversation about this. But the more that we're framing a conversation, not in terms of like what we're determined to get across, but in terms of, through that little voyage of discovery, understanding what the person you're talking to is interested in and then linking that back to climate change, that's a much more creative, generative way to approach the conversation. And that applies not just to climate change but to a galaxy of different issues. I mean, in a way, this is just basic good manners, right? To kind of be interested in who you're talking to and talk about things that you're both interested in. But it is also relevant to how we talk about political issues. And I think that the really key thing is that conversations in real life sort of have this capacity to tend naturally towards finding common ground. Whereas I do worry that conversations online, on social media, for example, often kind of, as we all know, the algorithms amplify the most shouty, polarizing opinions. And I think it's very much more difficult to find common ground with people across divides in online environments, if indeed the algorithms even put us in the same rooms as each other, because very often it just puts us in like echo chambers of the like-minded.
Can I introduce something else to the conversation? And that's the role of faith. Larger Us is not a faith based organization, but my understanding is you and the organization recognize the role that people of faith, the faith communities can play. In fact, I think you've spoken about there being a religion shaped hole in our society. And I just wonder how you see what you meant by that and what you see the role of faith playing in all this.
Right. Well, I suppose in some ways that was an idea that grew out of starting to notice a particular playbook that far right populists tend to use. I mean, actually, that extremists of all political stripes, not just on the far right, use that's very psychologically smart. And in particular, we talk about at Large Us, we talk about these five key elements of the kind of extremist playbook, where one part is amping up people's sense of threat. It's exactly what you see happening, for example, at a MAGA rally. Secondly, really preying on experiences of loneliness. We're all aware, I think, of the idea that there's a so-called epidemic of loneliness at the moment. And of course, there's lots of evidence that when we are chronically lonely, that can make us more vulnerable to conspiracy theories, to extremist views. Hannah Arendt, famously in her book *The Origins of Totalitarianism*, argued that totalitarian regimes seek to create loneliness because it creates exactly the kind of political culture where they can thrive. So that's the second thing. The third thing is that I think extremists always look to play up othering and scapegoating, create a kind of them and us dynamic. The fourth thing is to prey on experiences of shared loss, because, of course, in a poly crisis, there are many experiences of shared loss, whether you're talking about big global issues or much more local ones like dying industries or town centers that are decaying. Again, populists are very good and extremists at turning this into grievance. We call it the grief to grievance pipeline at Larger Us. And then, fifth and finally, stories are really, really important because, as Jonathan Haidt observes, the human mind is a story processor, not a logic processor. And extremists often have very resonant stories. These are stories of, they're not the sort of helpful stories that bring us together, quite the opposite, but nevertheless, they're very resonant. And the thing that always fascinates me is if you're wondering how to counter this very smart, divisive playbook, I think you can get a long way just by tipping it on its head. So rather than taking people into, states where they feel threatened, imagine if more of us had the ability to steady ourselves in the face of things we find threatening and to kind of take a conscious choice about how to respond rather than our amygdala automatically taking us into fight, flight, freeze mode. Secondly, imagine if like more of us were really focusing constantly on building belonging, building cultures of welcome. It's something we go on and on about in the charities and NGOs that we work with, saying you guys are always just asking people for $10 a month or sign this petition. You could be creating belonging. Goodness knows there's an appetite for it out there. Thirdly, really recognizing what we share so that instead of scapegoating and othering, we're kind of living out a vision of unity and diversity together, understanding them as two sides of the same coin. Fourthly, that rather than allowing experiences of shared loss to curdle into grievance, we're coming together to grieve for them. It's really psychologically important. And then fifth, rather than telling, bad stories about some shadowy other that threatens us, let's tell the kinds of stories that, inculcate a sense of hope for the future in us and a sense of how we come together to bring that future about. Now, if you look at those five capacities together, steadying ourselves, creating welcome, creating spaces where we recognize what we share, grieving experiences of shared loss, and telling hopeful stories, that's a pretty good summary of what, at their best, religions have always been all about. And I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about religion. They're a very specific kind of institution that has always existed at the cusp, both of inner and outer, and the cusp between individual and collective experience. And now that religious observance, of course, is declining really quickly in most developed countries, I think it creates this fascinating question about, well, whose job is this stuff now? If those five capacities that I just mentioned are important not just for our individual well-being, but actually for the democratic health of the societies we live in, whose job is it to help us and support us and encourage us in the lifelong work of developing those capabilities? Once the answer was religion. For many of us, myself included, the answer still is religion. But equally, for the many, many people who have decided that they don't wish to be religiously observant, which institutions are going to be helping them to develop these capabilities? Because a lot depends on the answer to that question, I think.
But acknowledging that religion is on the decline in many quarters of the UK, Canada, the United States, Western Europe, do you still see a role for faith communities and people of faith? Have you seen examples of it? Has Larger Us worked with faith groups or, groups that are affiliated with the faith tradition?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen some incredibly hopeful examples. I mean, I think it's really important to caveat this by saying that, religions are very human institutions. They can be a tremendous force for good, they can be a tremendous force for ill. And we've seen that throughout human history, right? I mean, some of the worst, darkest places that we've gone to as a species or as peoples have been induced by religions. So I am not kind of Panglossian about this and assuming that religions are always a force for bringing us together or for steadying ourselves or, etc. But at their best, which is why I put that caveat in, at their best, religions can be amazing at this. And we've seen some really inspiring examples of that with groups that we've worked with. I mean, one of my favorite examples at the moment is that near where I live in the city of Leeds in the north of England, there's a particular hotel in one area of the city that is home at the moment to about 75 asylum seekers, people from a range of different countries. But what has happened in the current political context is that every Friday night you have a group of protesters on the other side of the street waving British and English flags and shouting Islamophobic abuse at the people in that hotel. Almost as soon as those protests began, you had then a group of counter protesters arrive on the other side of the street, separated by lots and lots of police, shouting back at the first lot of protesters. And it's a bit like kind of ping pong, where the two are just kind of shouting at each other, and nothing's really getting transformed. But what started to happen last autumn, was that a group of people from local churches started going along every Friday night with cakes, with little cupcakes, and offering them to people on both sides of the street, and indeed to the police in the middle, and just having curious conversations with everybody. And it was such an interesting and subversive and quietly radical act, because I mean, a lot of those people were from a particular church in Leeds called All Hallows Church, which is one that I know very well. And I know that the people at All Hallows are deeply committed to anti-racist work. In many ways, it would have been very natural for them to go and join the protesters on the same side of the street as the hotel and shout abuse at all the protesters, waving the flags. But I think that by going and having conversations instead, what they were doing was partly dialing down the temperature and taking some of the heat out of the situation, but also really resisting the kind of dehumanization that populists and extremists want to promote by kind of living out their belief that everybody has inherent worth and value and dignity, and by talking to absolutely everybody, they're sort of just making a point through their actions about what we have in common, about people's inherent worth, and so on. And it actually got to the point where they had built up enough trust to broker a small private conversation between some of the protesters from each side, which I find just incredibly hopeful. I mean, it's so bucking the trend of the sort of division that we see so much of at the moment. And I think that the fact that they weren't just offering cakes, although that's a really good entree to a conversation, but also that, some of the people involved were visibly kind of priests, like wearing dog collars and so forth. They have a sort of particular status, if you like, that enables them to, play this kind of role. So that's an example I really like of how faith groups can be amazing bridge builders.
And I'm talking to someone who talks about the value of stories. I love that story. Do you have one more? Because I think these give us a sense of what Larger Us is all about.
Well, I think, I mean, there's, one of my favorite ones comes from actually one of our participants in Let's Talk Climate, the curious conversations about climate change training that I mentioned earlier. It made us laugh such a lot at the time. There was a woman who'd done our training who went away for a weekend in Norfolk on the east coast of the UK. And I think she was sort of staying at some kind of, nice, I don't know if it was a pub or a hotel. It sounded kind of upmarket, but she was there enjoying a glass of wine in the bar one evening. And then she heard this enormous noise outside and she thought, what on earth is happening? She peered out of the window and someone was landing a helicopter on the lawn of this hotel, which is what makes me think that it was probably kind of an upmarket hotel. But anyway, then the guy who was flying the helicopter swaggers into the bar, and you can tell he's absolutely delighted by the kind of entree he's just made. And the woman who'd done our training was, as she related to us later, she was in this agony of indecision, thinking like, he's flying a helicopter to the pub for a drink. I mean, this is insane. I should clearly say something. I should have a climate conversation over, is it going to go badly? Is it going to turn into an argument? Is he going to get cross with me, etc.? And anyway, she sort of, gathered all her courage and just gently, in a light-hearted way, started having a climate conversation with this guy. And she was, deliberately not shaming him. She wasn't calling him out. There was just some gentle teasing. And then some of the other people in the bar joined in, and they were also gently teasing. And it was all sort of perfectly good natured. And when she was relating this back to us a couple of weeks later, her kind of comment on the overall encounter was, well, I'm not sure anyone had their minds changed that day, but I was glad that I'd given it a go. And we thought, well, wow, good for you for giving it a go. But also, for one thing, I'm not sure that guy's going to fly to that pub in a helicopter again in a hurry after the reception he got. Not that he was shamed, but just that there was some gentle teasing going on. But also, more seriously, that by breaking the kind of social silence around climate change and saying something, what she surfaced was that actually there was a consensus in that bar that night about climate change being important. And by breaking the silence, she made that consensus visible. She created space that other people could come into and share their perspectives. And I think that's a beautiful example of why conversations are so important. I mean, we often talk in our trainings about the fact that no really transformational movement has ever achieved breakthroughs without conversations being part of the mix. I mean, that is clearly true of the equal marriage movement in the US. It's clearly true of the movement that got abortion legalized in Ireland. It's clearly true of the debate we're having in the UK right now about the right to die, where now 75% of Brits are in favor of it. Another huge, deep values shift, which has been driven by ordinary people starting conversations with people that they meet in the queue at the post office, at the bus stop, on the dog walk, and so on. So I think that, if it can be easy to feel powerless in these times of kind of enormous global issues and polycrisis and so on, but actually it's worth remembering that the little everyday conversations we have the whole time are the things that determine the political space that all the kind of politicians work within, and that actually just creating spaces for people to feel heard and to figure out what they think about issues and so on can have a lot more political impact than we might think.
And a Larger Us takes its learnings, it obviously incorporates it into new training programs that you're undertaking. You also, I think, have a blog where you share some of your findings, do you?
Yes, it's on Substack. It's called the Good Apocalypse Guide. Anyone who would like to check that out can find it at goodapocalypse.substack.com. And it's a fairly tongue-in-cheek look at the idea that we're living through apocalyptic times, but that apocalypses, they don't actually mean the end of the world. They mean revelatory moments of unveiling when what is actually real and true becomes clear. And in that regard, I think this is a good example of an apocalyptic moment and one that can be used to all sorts of creative and hopeful effect.
Well, we'll certainly share on the show notes information of how to find out more about Larger Us and about the podcast. But I want to thank you. We could go on. I'd love to hear more stories, but we're running out of our allotted time, but I want to thank you so much for joining us and for sharing the important work you're doing, and also the insights, very important insights that are doing so much to building bridges. So thank you for joining Disagreeing Well.
Thanks so much, John. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Next week, I'll be exploring the relationship between the media and polarization as I talk with Bill Killorn, Executive Director of Journalists for Human Rights.
I do think even in well-sophisticated media ecosystems, polarization is becoming an issue, and it's because it's a way to guarantee readership. If you're only telling people what they want to hear and reinforcing that, they're going to love coming to your newspaper every day and reading the stories. If you're not being challenged with different viewpoints, if you're just reinforcing what you already believe, it's a good way to maintain readers and then try to chase some advertising revenue as a result.
You've been listening to Disagreeing Well, a production of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, federated with Wilfrid Laurier University, located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Disagreeing Well is produced and edited by Lauren Kivenhoven with additional production and promotional support from Hardika Ahuja. Our theme music is Stuck in Dreams by Kulikova, courtesy of Pixabay. You can find Disagreeing Well on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and please follow us there. To find links to each episode, show notes, and to learn more about the work of the Center for Public Ethics, you can also follow us on our free Substack. Thanks for listening.